Hello, my name is Hallie, and welcome to this exploration of hearing. In this review, it's helpful to think of hearing as a domino effect, where sound is absorbed as vibrations, which can be carried on a chain, if you will, through the outer, middle, and inner ear, and then translated into a nerve impulse. We'll also evaluate the ear's role in our ability to understand acceleration, rotation, and balance, as well as gain an understanding of how our auditory stimuli will be processed and sent to the brain. And by the end of this review, we'll have a better understanding of the anatomy and function of the ear, and we'll be able to map out the auditory processing pathway. And we'll be able to evaluate questions such as the one at the bottom of the screen, which asks us to correctly identify the auditory pathway. Let's begin our dissection of ear anatomy with the outer ear. And there are four primary structures that we will want to know about the outer ear for test day. One being the auricle, also known as pinna, the earlobe, the external auditory canal, and the tympanic membrane, also known as the eardrum. The purpose of the external ear is to collect sound waves from our environment and to help them to collect and enter into the auditory canal where they can interact with the tympanic membrane. Once the sound wave is able to collide with the tympanic membrane, it will cause that eardrum to vibrate. And this vibration helps us to determine some characteristics about the sound waves that we have just collected. Physics tells us that sound waves are longitudinal waves, and these are defined by period, speed, and frequency. However, for the purposes of the behavioral sciences portion of the MCAT, what we really want to know is that frequency, or the number of revolutions per second, will determine the pitch of the sound that we are hearing, and the amplitude will determine the intensity of the sound. Now that the sound has been collected and collided with the eardrum, we will need to pass that sensory stimuli through the middle ear. And the middle ear basically starts where the outer ear left off. And it contains the ossicles, which are infamously known as the three smallest bones in the body. And the bones are the malleus, also referred to as the hammer, the incus, also called the anvil, and the stapes, or the stirrup. Remember that the auditory canal and the tympanic membrane are part of the outer ear. However, the malleus is in direct contact with the tympanic membrane and creates a chain with the incus and the stapes. And the stapes rests on the oval window. And the oval window is the border between the middle and inner ear. And this is important because when the tympanic membrane begins to vibrate after the collision of a longitudinal wave, the malleus will begin to vibrate because it's directly attached to the tympanic membrane. The malleus will then act on the incus, hence the hammer and anvil nickname. And the incus will begin to vibrate and act on the stapes. Once the stapes vibrates, it will be in contact with the oval window, allowing that vibration to pass into the inner ear. One other feature to note in the middle ear is that it's connected to the eustachian tube, which is part of the nasal cavity. And without this, we wouldn't be able to equalize the pressure in our ears. And without this capability, we would have a very hard time doing activities like scuba diving or popping our ears on long plane rides. Now that the sound vibration has been passed along to the oval window, it can enter into the inner ear. And the inner ear basically begins where the middle ear left off. And there are three inner ear structures that we'll want to know for test day: the vestibule, the semicircular canals, of which there are three, and the cochlea. The cochlea is also known as the hearing apparatus, and this is because it contains the hair cells. And the hair cells are absolutely essential in translating the vibrations caused by the sound wave into an electrical impulse that can be transduced down the auditory nerve. These structures are surrounded by fluid media, the first being the perilymph, represented in purple in this image. And this is predominantly available so that it can cushion the structures, but it also transmits the sound vibration from the oval window to the cochlea. There's also the endolymph, which is represented in blue, which fills the cochlea and the semicircular canals and is available in order to bathe the hair cells. Now that the vibration caused by sound has been finally passed into the inner ear, let's take a closer look at the cochlea because it has a key role in translating that vibration into a nerve impulse. The cochlea is made of three fluid-filled chambers. So if we take a cross-section of the cochlea, we would see that two of the chambers are filled with perilymph. So now that the perilymph is vibrating and within the cochlea, it can cause the middle chamber, which contains endolymph, to vibrate as well. There are four other important structures to note in the cochlea, one being the basilar membrane, which can also vibrate. There's the tectoral membrane, which, ta-da, is actually the first structure that we bump into in the ear that is relatively immobile. And that may seem irrelevant, but it actually plays a pretty important role. There's also the hair cells, which are attached to the basilar membrane. And the hair cells are not actually made of hair, they're made of tufts of cilia, and they do contain mechanosensory receptors. And this is interesting because the hair cells are able to translate the vibrations initiated by the sound wave into a nerve impulse. And this occurs when the hair cell comes into contact with other parts of the inner ear, and the cilia will actually bend. Then the hair cell can depolarize and initiate a nerve impulse onto the auditory nerve. And it's through this bending of cilia that we're able to translate a sound vibration into a nerve impulse. The primary purpose of our ear is to collect and process auditory stimuli. However, the inner ear does also play a role in our ability to balance and interpret motion. Referring back to the inner ear, the cochlea was considered the hearing apparatus, but there were two other structures in the inner ear that were worth noting. One of which was the semicircular canals, of which there were three, and these are sensitive to rotational acceleration. Now there are three semicircular canals because they can interpret your rotational acceleration on your X, Y, and Z axis. For example, when you tilt your head from side to side and touch your ear to your shoulder versus nodding up and down versus turning your head to look left and right. The vestibule is sensitive to our linear acceleration and has an important role in our ability to balance and orient in space. The semicircular canals and vestibule have hair cells identical to what we would see in the cochlea. And when these hair cells depolarize, they will send an impulse down the auditory nerve to be processed by the brain. So now we can look at the big picture of how we transmit a sound wave to our brain. We do receive an auditory input from our environment, which will travel to the inner ear, specifically the cochlea, where that signal will be translated into a nerve impulse by the hair cells. This will then be transduced onto the auditory nerve. Now, for the sake of the MCAT, we don't need to know what any of the following structures do, we just need to know what order they come in. So after the signal leaves the auditory nerve, it'll be sent to the superior olive. And yeah, there's actually a part of your brain called the superior olive. The signal will then be transferred to the inferior colliculus, relayed to the medial geniculate nucleus, and then sent to the temporal cortex. Well, I think we're ready for some practice questions, such as this one, which asks us to correctly identify the structures that are involved in auditory processing. And the correct answer is C. The temporal lobe, superior olive, and thalamus are involved in auditory processing, while the occipital lobe and lateral geniculate nucleus are involved in visual processing. We can also attack questions which ask us to identify the correct order of the auditory pathway. And the correct answer is A. The ear canal is part of the outer ear, the ossicles and oval window are part of the middle ear, and the hair cells and auditory nerve are part of the inner ear. To summarize, what we really want to know for test day about hearing is that the outer ear begins the domino effect by collecting sounds from our environment and translating that sound into a vibration on our eardrum. That vibration will be transmitted to the middle ear and then travel along the ossicles until it's transferred to the inner ear. And the inner ear will use hair cells to convert that vibration into an electrical signal that will be transduced onto the auditory nerve. The auditory nerve will then send that signal through the superior olive, inferior colliculus, medial geniculate nucleus, and temporal cortex for processing. Well, congratulations on completing this assessment of hearing. Hopefully you enjoyed gaining a better understanding of how your own inner ear is translating the longitudinal sound waves that are coming out of your speaker right now. Thank you for joining me, and as always, best of luck on your exam.